My name is Iván Carrillo. I'm a member of our governmental relations team here on ACSA staff. I'm joined by Senator Josh Newman, representing the 29th Senate District. And so we're going to engage in a fireside chat. And Senator, just thank you very much for helping us kick off this event. This is something we look forward to annually. More than 90 meetings set up with legislative offices and legislators on issues that are important to public education, issues that we know will make a difference in young people's and students' lives. But it means a lot to us that you've taken the time. We know it's really busy here in Sacramento and around the Capital.
So let me say good morning to everybody. And this is a tough-looking crowd. But I understand this is the first time you're back in person, so post-pandemic. So welcome to your state capitol, and this is exciting for me. So thank you for having me.
No, thank you. Senator, I wanted to start with just some background on you. You took a very unconventional path to the state legislature. It's unique to from that of your colleagues. So just if you don't mind just sharing a little bit about your background and how you ended up in the state legislature.
Oh, I don't know. So I guess I'm unique or noteworthy in that I didn't serve on another elected body prior to running in 2016 to represent the 29th Senate District. Very briefly, my background, I'm a graduate at Yale University. Post-college, I served in the United States Army as an artillery officer, and after that worked in local government, public affairs, did some time in the entertainment business. The only thing that's actually interesting about me is that if you've seen the movie Austin Powers, and you know that scene where the fembots kill the guards, I'm one of the guards, right? So that's the only thing my colleagues think is interesting about me. And then I worked in technology for a number of years, and then I got very interested as a veteran in why young vets were having, this is around 2012, so much trouble coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan, finding meaningful employment, career-oriented employment, and that actually led to getting first deeply involved in the Orange County and kind of greater LA veteran advocacy community. But through that, working with a bunch of elected officials and frankly getting very frustrated. And frustrated enough that I think it was late 2014, I had come back from Sacramento. I actually got to testify in front of the Assembly Committee on Veterans Affairs, and I thought it was an awesome kind of bucket list thing. When I came home and I told my wife about it and told her it was just as weird as everything else I'd done with elected people, it was she who said at that moment, our state senator, Bob Huff, has turned out, if you really want to change things, you should run. And I am just naive and kind of dumb enough that I say, that's a good idea. And she actually she'll admit she said it, she's regretted it thousands of times since. And that really was, and I guess you have another question about my checkered political past, but we'll get to that. And so so for me, as somebody who actually, prior to that moment probably, really wasn't considering running, it's an amazing, wonderful privilege for me to be part of the legislature, to be one of 40 members of the state senate, one of 120 total legislators in a state of 40 million people, the greatest state in the greatest country of the world. So, that always informs kind of my perspective on doing this work. And so it's also, a continuation, I think, of the public service that I found so rewarding in the military. This is another version of that. So not always pleasant, but certainly, a privilege to do.
Thank you. So you chair the Senate Education Committee. We laugh about it in the Sacramento education community oftentimes, that it's a committee that is not very sought after within the legislature. People aren't vying to be on these committees.
So you're telling me it's not the Juice Committee?
No.
That I was tricked into doing this? Oh my goodness.
And now you chair the committee, and we know that you were very public about this was a committee you wanted to not only serve on, but you wanted to lead. So can you just share a little bit about why the leadership position on this committee was so important to you?
So certainly. So every 2 years we have a set of elections, and in the last set, we had 3 members who either termed out or left, and they were the chairs of the Senate committees on health, education, and energy. And so those seats, those chairmanships had opened up. I had, for the past 2 years, I served as the chair of something called the Senate Special Committee on Pandemic Emergency Response. So I had, what I would describe as kind of a ringside seat to all things pandemic. And as part of these larger conversations and coming out of the pandemic, as we've discussed, the impacts on lots of different communities and groups really severe, but nowhere as great as in education, and not just students, but also educators, staff, parents. And so when the pro tem asked, what committee would you like of those three, the way I think about it is, what is more important than education? Right? And I guess the other way to think about it, I'm probably not the best person to be the chair of health, right? My dad was a doctor, but that's the limit of my credentials. But on energy, we have I have lots of colleagues who wanted that spot. And so I thought there is no more important work to be done, I think, in the next couple of years, other than around education. So I was happy to do it. Thank you.
Well, we're certainly happy that you're in that position as well, and our members are hearing it and experiencing it firsthand right now. But you've just been a wonderful leader in terms of the committee, and appreciate just your openness and dialoguing with school leaders throughout the state and within your community. You have prided yourself on being pragmatic, referred to yourself as a centrist, and so just wondering how are you. What's your approach to chairing the education committee, and what's your philosophy?
So, again, I'm always aware of what are kind of interesting, opportunities or responsibilities is to be a member of this committee, but a member of the body, and so giant state, incredibly diverse, massive budget. We have a feature in California's Governance Prop 98, which is different than many states, which by formula allocates monies for education, but within that, there's, it gets very complicated. And so the way I think about education is probably not that different than the way you think about your jobs. It's a system of systems, and the interaction of all these systems is incredibly complex. And it's, so there's always a constituent or constituency, that wants or needs something, but there are all manner of ripple effects throughout the system when we make any change. That's going to be especially true this year, as we look at a very different fiscal landscape than we have over the past couple of years. And as you mentioned, I'm a pragmatic guy. I mean, I like to think of myself as just smart enough to know kind of the right questions to ask and what I don't know. And when it comes to education, there's a lot I don't know, right? So, but I think that's important because of just how complex the system is and how many different constituencies are coming at it from different directions. So my role as the chair is to make this work, right? To the extent that I can, is to make education work in California and to make it better over time. And it's really that simple.
We've come out of the gate fast this legislative session. You've held a number of hearings, nearly a historic number of bills that have been introduced. Just wondering if you could shed a little bit light on your priorities, whether it be a part of your bill package or just more broadly speaking, your priorities this session.
As chair, my priority again is to make it work. And so you folks probably know this. It's your ledge day. Of the 2,600 bills that were introduced across both houses of the legislature this year, I'm told that 228 relate to education, which is an immense number of bills. Right? So we have sort of a simultaneous system where stuff works its way through the Senate and conversely across the Assembly. So we're working on the Senate side, and no shortage of bills there. There's probably more members, more bills on the Assembly side. And so it's just a torrent of legislation. I have a hearing on Wednesday. I think we have 12, 13 bills up, of which one, I think two are mine. Actually, one's on consent. I had a couple of bills that I was doing, prior to being named the chair. One is about recess, about ensuring a kind of a baseline standard for recess across the state. The other is about all gender bathrooms, which clearly there's an equity issue that I think is very important. There's also a practical issue, equally important, to make sure that as we solve the equity issue, we don't saddle school districts and administrators with a massive set of liabilities by way of construction, or other kinds of exposure. And then, got a bill to study how to better create licensing portability across the state. And then one that I'm very grateful to have ACSA as a sponsor, and that's SB 494. And that's to get at something that we've seen recently, but most specifically in the Orange Unified School District, where the superintendent immediately following the reorganization, the board was summarily terminated with an apparent lack of public noticing, and as a result, a lack of public participation, in apparent violation of the Brown Act, by the way. And so, so the bill, and I'm again glad to be doing it with ACSA, would tighten that up and provide this, the same amount of noticing for a termination proceeding as we do for a hiring proceeding. To try and tamp down what we're seeing is for reasons that are kind of obvious but very sad. Education has become the new battleground, right, for the culture wars, and that's really unfortunate as it relates to trustees, administrators, students, educators, in a state where we have enough on our plate trying to raise the level and the achievement of our students.
Thank you for shedding light on that.
Yeah.
Wanted to ask you, you just referred to 200 and something bills that have been introduced related to education. So those that you've been able to review and look at, just what type of trends are you seeing in terms of legislative landscape that are being introduced by your colleagues?
Right. So we've had a substantial amount of legislative turnover over the last cycle. So there's, I think, 37 out of the 120 are new members, and this is actually a nice thing about California's politics or governance that we get as a result of term limits. Redistricting also had an impact. You get new people, right? That's all in probably a good thing. But because education is so complicated, because everything we do is part of, I think you can think of it as an ongoing conversation. People who are new to this conversation often either underestimate the degree of difficulty of making change, or don't always consider kind of the sort of the corollary impacts of the changes they might advocate. So we have on both sides, but especially the Assembly side, a bunch of new members that are bringing, I think, really worthy, kind of admirable principles or efforts around equity, access, curriculum, sort of guidance, and put that into legislation. And the legislative process is the way that we sort of assimilate and test and assimilate these ideas. So that's ongoing, and it's not always pretty, but I think at the end of the day we wind up better for it, and we'll wind up with I think a bunch of groups across the state that are better represented, that have better advocates as a result.
A moment ago, you referred to this kind of how schools have become the epicenter for these broader, real divisive cultural and political fights that we're seeing playing out nationally. No shortage of stories from our members, whether it be at the site level or district level, having experienced just engagement on one side or the other of these real hotly contested issues. So I'm just curious, how are you and your colleagues talking about these issues? What role do you think the state has in addressing what we're seeing bubbling up across the state?
So the state has actually a very limited role as it relates to kind of the politics at the school board level, and that's mostly a good thing. But I think in this context it creates challenges because I think we all agree that what's going on is less than productive, right? Less than positive. But in many cases, I've had conversations with trustees in my district who are just at wit's end because they were part of, say, a 3-2 kind of centrist majority, which is now a 4-1 kind of extreme right majority, and unfortunately that's what elections are about, right? And so our job at the state level is to create a roadmap and a set of guidelines that mitigate those impulses, that protect, to the extent possible, education generally, but all the participants within education. That's what 494 is about. That's what the superintendent I know is doing some good work in that regard as well. But the most important thing is taking into account that we give school districts across the state. There's more than 1,000. A certain level of autonomy. That for the most part you're self-governed, and people don't realize just how important those elections are. So one of the things that we're actually considering in the legislature, which I think is really worthy, is your ballot when you go vote. You typically vote sort of top down, and what we see is somebody comes to vote in the presidential cycle for the president. Then there's Congress, Senate, Congress, state legislature. We see a drop off as people get toward the bottom. I think there's a good, very persuasive argument for flipping that and exposing people at the top of the ballot to those positions which they may not think about, but which are fundamentally important. And one of those, one of those categories is boards of education. We need to elevate those conversations and those elections so that people are not only well apprised, but fully engaged.
You mentioned SB 494, a bill that you're authoring, a bill that ACSA is proudly sponsoring. Just want to make sure for our members, this is in response to what we've seen in one of the, as you mentioned, real well-documented cases was in Orange County where a board did flip. And then without transparency, use of emergency meeting, public didn't have the ability to engage, the superintendent didn't have the ability to respond. So appreciate your authorship of that bill. It is noted on the backside of our leave behind document. Anything else you want to say about SB 494?
No, again, I mean, this is, the extreme example is often the teaching example, as they say. This is not different than we're seeing in many other districts, but I mean, this was a textbook example. The superintendent wasn't even in the country, right? And she is or was, by all accounts, a wonderful administrator doing a wonderful job. And the reasons for her dismissal had zero to do with the quality of her work. And that is the alarming facet. To the extent that the voters put in place 4 people who had an opinion, we can't stop that, but we can certainly try and affect an input process and a hiring and firing process that holds people to a standard that is reasonable and necessary.
You were first elected to the Senate in 2016. You experienced a recall. You were recalled from your Senate seat. For taking a courageous vote, one that you knew at the front end would come with some consequence. And our school leaders are in positions where they have to make very difficult decisions on a daily basis, and they make those decisions because they know they're in the best interest of students. So just curious in terms of, as a leader, what can you talk about just being very value-driven, having your principles be that guiding light? Anything you took away from that experience that you've
So this is the checkered past to which I referred. And it's, so in addition to the Austin Powers thing, which my colleagues think is interesting, I also have the weird distinction of being the only legislator in California state history to lose my seat as a result of recall and regain the same seat. So I'll have that in my obituary. I'm very proud of that. But what Iván's referring to is in 2017, the legislature voted, actually it was in April, to raise the state's gas tax through a measure, SB 1. Then all the bills are named chronologically, so that was the most important bill of the year. And we took what was, obviously going to be a difficult vote. I would be fibbing if I told you that I knew that I was going to be recalled as a result of this vote. And so, woe unto me. So I had no idea, right? So I thought, wow, this is a tough vote. And it, to raise taxes in California, it takes 2/3 votes in both houses. So in the Assembly, there were 54 Democrats who voted for it. In the Senate, there were 27 members, of whom 26 were Democrats. 1 was a Republican. So imagine my surprise when this narrative started to develop that there was this guy, Josh Newman, in Orange County who was the deciding vote on raising your gas tax. And I kept saying, it's a guy named Anthony Cannella. He's the Republican guy. He's from the Central Valley. It took form, gained hold. And so in June of 2018, my name was on the ballot, and I was actually the yes, kick him out, beat no, keep him by a pretty decisive margin in a relatively low turnout election. And so, what did I learn about that? Well, I'm back, right? So, that proves that I'm either really committed to public service or I'm a glutton for punishment. But I have no regrets about that vote, and I will say, and this is different, I think, than the work that you do, right? So, so I came here, excited, proud to be a public servant, but I'm glad to go, do other things, right? Kind of, and so it's not the end of the world. There are worse things than losing an election for doing the right thing, right? And so I think hopefully I'm proof of that. But as far as how I apply that moving forward, that's about as bad as it gets, right? So when I told my wife, I think it was late 2018, it was like, hey, I'm thinking about running again. I think that, in a regular election, I could get my old job back. And I remember she looked at me and kind of rolled her eyes. She was like, oh. And I said, come on, it can't get any worse, right? And she said, oh, yes, it can, Josh. It always seems to with you. And the truth is, it hasn't, right? It hasn't. And so, to be back and to do this is a privilege. But I've seen the worst of it, and there is no stranger moment than getting the poll results. And it's not even an election. Like an election is, me versus Iván, right? And people like Iván more, and I can rationalize that. This is a referendum on you, right? And the people have spoken, and you are awful, right? You're out. As I thought it through, I realized I actually am not. I wouldn't have done anything differently. I'd like to think I'd apply the same standard moving forward. And as it relates to education, again, there are so many people with strong opinions. We have a bill that is coming up on Wednesday that is a perennial bill about vouchers, right? About allocating funds for private schools, for religious institutions, out of Prop 98 funds. It always comes back. And I have an opinion, and my opinion is that public education in California is the most important thing that we do, and I'm not going to do anything to dilute that. And so I'm sure I will have a meeting within the next 2 days with my colleague, Senator Grove, where she expresses her disappointment for that idea. But that's how we have to do this work. And at the end of the day, our ultimate bosses are the folks who sent us here. And until they send me away again, I'm glad to be doing this. Yeah.
You referenced that nearly a quarter of the legislature is new, and so the legislative makeup is very different. We celebrate it. We've been talking about it. That for the first time in our state's history, there are 50 women legislators, and so closing that gap and inching closer to parity. Just curious how have you seen in terms of differences with this new legislative crop that's come in terms of what's being prioritized, the types of conversations, anything that you can point to?
I mean, again, I think I referenced it. So, a lot of interesting, sort of energy ideas about education. All good. As long as people realize that they're joining a conversation already underway, they're joining a legislative process that is really complex, right? And they're talking about amending a system that is eminently complex. But this is good, right? I mean, if we take things too much for granted, we probably will lose sight of the necessary changes and improvements we have to make. So I think that captures the spirit as much as anything. And so as we move forward, what I worry most about is I think term limits, they're not going to change, right? But they not only have an impact on how people do the work, but also how people sort of conceive of the work that they do. And there's a bunch of dimensions to that. And part of it is because we have all these new members, that vests in staff, especially at the committee level, sort of a higher level of influence authority than most people might assume. We as legislators have to make sure that we're doing this in our name, well, actually in your name, on behalf of the constituents who sent us here, and that we're not too deferential to kind of institutional authority or sort of assumptions. And so that's again part of the larger question. So as an example, Senator Portino has a bill that would shift the funding basis from ADA to enrollment. I think that's an important conversation to have, especially as it intersects with the Prop 98 regime. But these things are not simple by any means, and so I think you have to be aware that you will not change Rome in a day, but we shouldn't stop trying to improve education, especially by way of evidence-based metrics, so that we know that with the plans that we undertake and the monies we spend, we know we're getting the best return for those.
Can you talk a little bit about the importance of this? What our members?
These people right here. Yes.
Yes. Just this action, this coming and directly engaging with their representatives and expressing a position on something that has consequence, policy conversations that are being considered. I think we've all probably experienced these moments in our lives where we question and we ask ourselves, is our voice really going to make a difference? Is me calling going to make a difference? Is me sharing a story going to make a difference? Can you just talk about, does it make a difference? And what advice do you have to them as they're going to jump into
Sure.
to meetings across the street with their
Sure,
representatives.
and show of hands, how many for our first visit? For how many visits your first visit? So a fair number. And so so you haven't been here since like your 8th grade trip, right? What people often don't realize is, for the state being so big, for these systems being so complex, it's actually more open and sort of more democratic with a small d than I think people realize. And your participation is really meaningful, or prospectively, determinative. And so at the committee level, I'm always happy, I'm always better for having as witnesses and participants, actual, practitioners in the field. When it comes to actually advocating to your respective members of the legislature, remember that they work for you, and they more often than not won't be as well apprised on the subject matter as you folks. And so it really is incumbent upon you, when you get time with them, and to make clear like what's important, especially to your schools, your parents, your students. And I know that means a lot to our members, assuming you can get their attention and keep it, right? And so this is the advice I give to people on Ledge Days. So you're going to all go around the Capitol, and you're going to wait your turns to see your respective members, and say your meeting's at 11:30. At 11:35, you'll be sitting outside waiting. At 11:37, maybe they'll come in, and so your meeting's going to go for half an hour. And so the one thing you should know about my colleagues, if you don't already, is the one thing that we're all good at is making small talk, right? And the one thing that they love about small talk is it's a good way to run out the clock, right? So and this is honest advice, right? So what you want to do when you finally get into the meeting is make sure you get to the subject matter, not, oh, my kid went to your school, does Mrs. Jenkins still teach there? That's all awesome, but that's not a good use of your time. And as you be firm. And I'm always struck by, so you're all superintendents and other like senior people in school districts, and so you're used to people listening to you, and so right, and you're used to especially people shorter than you listening to you, and so don't assume for a moment that my colleagues are listening to a word you're saying, right, and so don't be afraid to push them a little bit on that. Because it really does matter, and the thing you should consider is your meeting is part of a typical day, which the pace of this is the really interesting thing about the new members is there's this kind of, if you're a sports fan, they talk about the hard thing about making the transition from like college basketball, college football to the professionals. This pace of the game speeds up in a way that few people are ready for, and you have to adjust to it. It's absolutely true. So if you came here from a city council or a school board, the pace of this city, the pace of the legislative game is so fast, and you're in April right now. And so if you're going to meet with a new member, like they're still dealing with like, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? And remind them why you're here, and remind them why education is so important. Remind them why it's so important that they do right by you and your students and the families that depend on you. And that is my advice for you. And as you go through your 2 days, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about.
We're going to open it up to the audience to ask a couple of questions. I appreciate you being gracious with your time. I know we're over the noon hour, but the senator did have a couple more minutes to take a couple questions from the audience. So we have members of our vice presidents for legislative action. Maybe if we can ask one question, and then we'll wrap it up.
Good afternoon, Senator. Thank you for being here today. We've recognized that we can get a lot accomplished together with our legislators in ACSA. And my question for you today would be, with all of the complexities that you described today, what would you like to see your legacy be in 2 years with your work with the Education Committee?
You must know something I don't. 2 years. So I didn't realize the clock was ticking so loud. So it is to leave it better than I found it. To leave it better than I found it. And I have no delusions about kind of revolutionary changes that I'm going to make as the chair of this committee. As one of sort of the decision points in the legislative process, my aspiration is to make sure that we raise the level of discourse, we improve the level of rigor that we apply to considering policy ideas, and then at the end of the day, that the legislation that we actually move to the governor's office, that hopefully he signs, actually improves across all the different, sort of bases, the quality of education in California. And that is, that, as you know, it runs the gamut on a whole host of issues, not all of which are, sexy, but collectively are super important. And so, easiest metric is, where is California relative to other states? And I'd like to see us on an upward trajectory.
Senator, when we first connected, when you were coming into this new position that you have as chairperson of the Senate Education Committee, you told me you don't, and you said this at the onset too, that you don't know everything about education policy. You don't pretend to, but one thing you're going to be committed to is being open and hearing from those that are in the field, on the ground, dealing with these things. And I just want to commend you for being true to that. And these first 4 months, you've been very accessible to ACSA, to your local leaders. Thank you for spending time with us here today. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.